an invitation at the beginning of the week to ask questions that we couldn't answer and see if we can get help with answering them. So this is my question: what cognitive abilities do primates and children have in common, and how do they differ? A complete answer to that question, I think, is not something I can provide, but I would be very interested in being able to do that, and I'll try to explain why I think this group could find that question interesting as well. So are animal minds like human minds? We're here to talk about human intelligence, AI, and so what are animal minds doing at the table at all? As we've been hearing already today, there are a lot of things that we've known for decades that animals and humans have in common: reinforcement learning, conditioning, these kinds of core abilities of learning and memory that are shared, and animals are used as models to elucidate the details of the mechanisms that can underpin this sort of learning in a kind of stripped down context. But we also know from classical ethology that was sort of going on contemporaneously with the bell-bottom crew, the behaviorists, that there's a lot of other things that animals do, from interspecies cooperation between cleaner fish and archerfish, to the manufacture and use of tools in the chimpanzee, that don't fit neatly into this idea of reinforcement learning based on trial and error, things that are either occurring very quickly or in quite a creative and inventive way. And so comparative psychology has tried to bring these kinds of abilities under experimental study. So whether that's findings like something like insight problem solving in the chimpanzee, or episodic memory in California's own scrub jay, or physical reasoning in the New Caledonian crow. So are these abilities, like the human abilities of insight and episodic memory and physical reasoning? This is where I think our field has been in quite a vexed debate. So there will be some that want to argue that these abilities require new theories, new ways to understand intelligence in animals that are similar to some of the things that we might be interested in understanding in humans. And others that say, well, these are just examples of how far you can get with good old associative learning. And those debates can go back and forth a little bit. Nevertheless, everybody agrees that there are some aspects of human thinking that are unique, that are special. So what might those be? If there are some similarities, perhaps more than we think, between human minds and animal minds, what is left that makes us uniquely human? And here we also have kind of a embarrassment of riches in terms of the findings, where there have been suggestions that there are unique features from theory of mind to analogy, grammar, physical knowledge, future planning, flexible thinking, the list goes on. And these are built on studies where you can see an animal not performing as a human would. So it's usually a comparison between an adult human's performance in, say, a grammar extraction task and a monkey on a touchscreen with lots of trials, and the human performs in quite a different way. Or a test of theory of mind understanding that's been designed for children and is applied to chimpanzees, and they don't pass that test. And going along with these points of difference and points of contrast come lots of theories that cite this particular contrast between the human and the animal as the small change that made a big difference in human evolution. So I think for each finding, there's a corresponding theory that cites this as the upstream difference that makes the big difference to making us human. And so I think that here we also have some vexed debate. Which of these theories is right? They all have some evidence to support them. But what I would like to suggest, and where I think we need help, is that a satisfying account of human cognitive uniqueness, and in fact the uniqueness of any species, requires you to explain not just one of these differences, but all of them, for those that sort of stand up to replication. And more importantly, as we heard so beautifully from Shimon Ulmer's talk, the developmental cascades that lead to that emergence. So which of these differences are downstream, which are upstream? So in other words, we want to describe not just the finished product or the baked cakes, as Bateson puts it, but the ingredients and the method of baking that leads to them becoming different in the end. So Darwin also recognized that human intelligence is special, that we have these reasoning powers in excess. But he also suggested that mental machinery is just like anatomical machinery. It's something that we can study through an evolutionary lens, and we can look at how natural selection leads to adaptive radiation, so that we have many forms of intelligence, diverse intelligences, as Alison put it. So I think the goal of comparative psychology, and kind of the larger goal that underpins my work, is to be able to explain the radiation of say, primates or a wider group of animals in terms of their cognition, in the same way that we can explain the adaptive radiation of, say, the shape of the finch in Darwin's finches. That we know not just the shape that it takes anatomically, but what use it's put to, what it's evolved, what problems it's evolved to solve. And I think that's a challenge that we're just beginning to grapple with. So what kind of approach do we take in my group to this problem? So one thing that I think is important is to examine not just point differences between, say, an adult human and adult chimpanzee, but divergence, find points of commonality, and look at where we see differences, so we can kind of isolate what has changed, what is different between these two groups, because the difference could be caused by a lot of sort of upstream differences that are not being examined if we don't do that. So in other words, to take a truly comparative and developmental approach. And I won't say much about this, but the theoretical underpinning, and I think this has already been covered really nicely in Alison's talk, is that the resources available for cognition are limited. So when we look at that long list of differences, it's likely that these abilities interact, that there's going to be trade-offs or even enabling conditions, that changes in one cognitive system are going to have ramifications for other systems, if indeed we're carving those things at their joints in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to be talking mostly about primates today, and I wanted to introduce you to your relatives if you're not already familiar. So these are our closest relatives here, the great apes, and these are their brains to scale from this paper, Hauer et al. That did some lovely scanning work of the primate brain. And as you can see, we've got the biggest brain, that's nice, but the great ape brains are all quite large. But what I want to show you here is there's lots of lovely variation within the radiation of primates that might help us get a handle on differences in cognition if we look at the full radiation. So these are the catarrhine primates, what used to be called the old world primates, your macaques, your baboons. Here's a few examples of this family, a bit more distantly related to us, maybe our first cousins. And these are their brains. So as we can see, quite a bit more variation, smaller than the great ape brains. And these are the platyrrhine or flat-nosed monkeys, are more distantly related still. And this includes the capuchin and squirrel monkeys that we study in Edinburgh. So they're pictured there. And lots of lovely variation, actually, within that group of animals. So there's lots of variation in the size of the brain. There's variation in the size of the animal as well, I should say, but the size of the brain has also been shown to be quite reliably related to some cognitive abilities. And then last but not least come our most distant relatives, the lemurs, and they do have quite a bit, brains that are quite a bit smaller, and as we shall see, there may well be consequences in their cognition. So just briefly, this is the Living Links Centre to Human Evolution at Edinburgh Zoo, where I work, and there's lots of people who we collaborate with at Edinburgh Zoo to make that possible. And this is the capuchin and the squirrel monkey. They spend most of their time in their outdoor and indoor enclosures, but every now and again we invite them into these little cubicles where they'll spend about 10 minutes with us doing some studies. So just to introduce you to their habitat before I show you lots of videos of them in that cubicle. That's not where they spend most of their day. And they come into these cubicles voluntarily to work with us. If we don't present an interesting food or a good enough, an interesting task or a good enough reward, then they just don't come back the next day. Okay, so in terms of topics of study, on the one hand, I'm really interested in this idea of representation of cognitive models, and we work on representations of objects and agents. I'll mostly focus on objects today. But I'm become more and more interested in cognitive control. So there's not much, well, there's lots of utility to having a model to compare in this sort of predictive framework that we've been talking about of the world. But it becomes even more useful if you can use that model offline to make predictions. But that requires you to resist the incoming data. You need to be able to use your working memory. You need to be able to inhibit reacting to stimuli in the real world. You need some way to control your attention between internal and external stimuli. And we're also quite interested in the group in these other sorts of kind of cross-cutting abilities for learning information in the first place. Curiosity, also metacognition, but I won't talk about those unless anyone wants to. Okay, so I'll talk about 3 topics. I want to just give a sort of smorgasbord of findings to give you a flavor of the sorts of things that we're doing, and hopefully to be able to try and better formulate this question by the end that I began with. So firstly, representation of object properties. This is work that I did in collaboration with Juan Gomez, Derek Ball, our student Da Zhang, and Verena Kersken, who was a postdoc. And I'm going to show you a video, give you a break from me talking, a little look at a monkey. This is a paradigm that's based on work done first with infants, with Zhu and Carey, and has also been done with chimpanzees, to look at whether or not animals can represent objects that are absent from view and can have a representation that includes something about their features so that they can individuate those objects.
Do monkeys reason about objects? Possible outcome, to see if they noticed.
So the basic task is that you see 2 objects, one at a time, behind this barrier. And if you can use the individuation objects by their features, you should reason there are 2 objects now. So this is a surprising outcome.
They showed their surprise by looking longer when the outcome was impossible.
Clearly see the surprise in this toy example with my
Researchers
very hammy
gave capuchin monkeys a similar test. They dropped a date into a box. But there was only a grape to be found. Here, a monkey searches and finds the grape. Will he search again, realizing that there must also be a date? Yes, he did.
So this is a clip that we made for the visitors to Edinburgh Zoo, so we like to explain the studies that we're doing and the findings that we've got. But it shows quite nicely how it looks when we're testing these monkeys. But here's the data. So what you can see is that just like the chimpanzees that were tested before, and like 10 to 12-month-old infants, the capuchin monkeys are going to search more often. They're more likely to reach again in the case where both if there were 2 things that went in and they only find 1, or if something different goes inside and they find an object of a different identity. So what's kind of interesting about this is that when this was first found with infants, and it was quite late emerging, 10 to 12 months, there was a suggestion that this requires a label. You need to be able to label the objects to individuate and count them. But chimpanzees solved this task, and so do capuchin monkeys. So probably the labeling isn't necessary, at least not a verbal, linguistic label. However, our squirrel monkeys did not pass this test. So these are closely related monkeys. They do have a smaller brain. And what's quite interesting here is that 6-month-olds also don't pass this test. So we took a study that was used by Wilcox to test 6-month-olds to see, well, what's the problem here? Can we find object individuation in 6-month-olds if we make the display a little bit quicker, reduce some of the demands on memory? So this is when an object is moved behind a barrier and emerges as a different object. Do they expect the original object to be sitting behind the barrier? And 6-month-olds do show surprise if there's nothing behind the barrier. So they are able to pass this task when everything's moving a bit more quickly. So what about the squirrel monkeys?
Rita?
This is Da. The video isn't very easy to see, but this is how it happens. The object moves quickly, so does a squirrel monkey. Kind of annoys them if you take too long about things. So the object is moving, it hasn't changed identity, it ends up here. And the question is, where will she reach first? Now, when the object's identity has stayed the same, she reaches first to the last place that she saw it, as if she's tracking just one object. But, so that's this one here. But if it's a different object, then she chooses equally between the two barriers. So she's indifferent between the two because they're two equally preferred foods. It's a raisin and a peanut, if you ever need to know. So that's really interesting that we see this evidence, this signature of object individuation, if things are moving quickly. But actually, if we put even a slight delay with the objects just pausing a little bit behind that barrier, then we no longer see a significant difference between the conditions. This is kind of the opposite, if you've heard of it, of the tunnel effect. So if you see one object move behind a barrier and then emerges in the trajectory as if it was a single object, with the timing as if it was a single object by spatiotemporal information, us human adults will sometimes miss the idea that there's actually two objects or the objects changed identity. The opposite is true for the squirrel monkeys. If things don't move quickly enough, they don't seem to pick up on they don't individuate the objects effectively. So what can we say about object representations for monkeys? They are representing objects that are out of view in terms of some of their features. They're binding those features into their representation, but there are differences among these close relatives in the platyrrhine monkeys. Do these have consequences? So what can these two monkey species do when they need to make an inference, when they need to use their object knowledge? Presumably, the squirrel monkeys are going to have a hard time making use of object representations to solve problems. So we know from studies of chimpanzees that they can make inferences. If you shake 2 cups and one of them rattles, they can choose the noisy cup. If you shake only 1 cup and it makes no sound, they'll choose the other cup, so they can infer almost by exclusion from the silence of that. If you put 2 cups on a balance beam, they're able to choose the lower cup. If you put things behind 2 sloping boards, they can choose the sloped one. So they can make inferences based on this kind of core object knowledge. We didn't know much about capuchin and squirrel monkeys in this regard. So our student, Eleanor Jordan, did a study. And what we did was look to see whether or not they could infer that this paper towel will prevent you from getting a raisin. You need a lot of raisins to work with primates. So here, if you choose this option, she'll tip the raisin out and give it to you. If you choose this one, she'll tip it out and try her best, but the paper towel, just won't let her give it to them. In this case, we have an arbitrary condition where the learning problem is very similar. Choose the clear cup, and she'll give you the raisin. Choose this upside-down cup with a paper towel in the top, and she just won't. So in terms of the stimulus discrimination, it's the same problem, but this one allows you to kind of bring your object knowledge to the table as to explain why it works. So I'll just show you a quick clip of how this looks. So it's not a very subtle cue, it's quite a large cue. And if you choose the incorrect option, that's how it looks in the functional case. This is what visitors to Edinburgh Zoo also get to watch, little monkey hands coming out of windows. It's never gets so old, really. So that you make the wrong choice and you don't get a raisin. So what we found is that indeed this is the capuchin monkeys, and they performed quite well. This was only 24 trials, so there's not thousands of trials of reinforcement learning. This is something that they picked up on quickly, and they performed quite well in the causal case, and less well in the arbitrary case. But the squirrel monkeys didn't learn this in the trials that we gave them. So it seems like the squirrel monkeys are able to do something with their object knowledge that the squirrel monkeys can't. Maybe if we could have moved quickly enough, we would have been able to get the squirrel monkeys to make that inference, but maybe their representation just isn't robust enough. Okay, I'm going to talk about the other 2 topics and then try to bring a common thread between them. So this is a study that I did with Zeynep Sivilek and Christoph Volter, when they were both in the lab. And this is a comparison now between children, as promised, and the capuchin monkeys. And here we're looking Again, I could have called this talk A Tale of Two Cups, I guess. So we've got 2 cups again. And now they're covered with a foil covering. And what they're going to need to do is make an inference about which cup contains the reward, but now they're going to see only indirect information to make that inference. So the reward is hidden, and then you see that one of the foil coverings is now broken. And you also hear a sound. We were talking about cross-modal before, so you hear a punch kind of sound, and then this is what you see. And then behind the barrier comes back again, and a pencil or a stick goes behind the barrier. You hear another punching sound, and now we have 2 cups that have both been had their foil coverings removed. So the question is, can you use this kind of spatiotemporal information to infer that the reward must be here and not in the other cup? And then critically, if we change the order so that first we use the stick and then the sticker, can you rapidly update what you do and now take the second option? So this is kind of analogous to inferring what's happened from seeing a trace, like a set of footprints. And if you walk through a forest and you see a set of footprints, that's interesting. If you walk through the forest and you turn back and you see a set of new footprints that weren't there a second ago, that's a little bit more worrying. So can they make use of this kind of spatiotemporal information? I might skip the video in the interest of time. Okay, so this is what we found with children. This is their age in months along the x-axis, and this is how they performed in 8 trials. So what you can see is that from sort of 3 years of age, they're able to, over the 8 trials, kind of pick up on what they should do. And by the time they're about 4, they're really good at this. So even performing correctly from the first trial in this study. But when we change the order, you need to be more like 4 before you're able to quickly update what you're doing and perform correctly. So the 3-year-olds tended to get a little bit stuck with whatever they were doing before or just perform at chance. And the red dots are children who could explain why they made the choice that they made. So if you ask them at the end, why did you choose that cup? If they could give you something half decent, like that's where I heard you break the cover or something like this, then they get a red dot. So you can see that there's kind of an ability to output this explanation verbally in these older children. And in particular, that's very apparent when you look at that first trial of transfer. So children above the age of 4 are doing really well here, and below the age of 4, we don't see such good performance. So what about the capture monkeys? What we see is that they are tending to be above chance. Overall, they're significantly above chance, and they do pretty well in the transfer, but they don't perform correctly on that first trial. And they did need more trials, so that within the first sort of 8 trials, we don't have significantly above chance here. So when you need to make an inference of something that you've never seen, that you need to simulate, using presumably similar core knowledge abilities, this seems to be something that is more difficult for our capture monkeys even, and in fact is something that's emerging a little bit later in child development. So the 3-year-olds are also finding this challenging. Nevertheless, if we make a comparison with a sort of comparable learning problem, where instead of bursting the foil covers, we place a patterned cover instead in the same kind of spatiotemporal order, performance is pretty terrible. So it's not the case that what capuchins are doing here, we don't think, is just learning. Once I see this one, I should go for the one on the left. They're probably building up some kind of expectation about what happens using some of their object knowledge. I just don't think that they can run it offline to the extent that they could do it from the first trial. So in these and other studies, I've given an example, but we have other studies also from over-hypothesis formation, some work that I've done with Elisa Felscher and colleagues. What we found is that when we reduce demands on memory and attention, we make things quick and more transparent, we can find evidence for core object knowledge, inferential abilities, abstract representation, some sort of core ingredients, I think, of causal thinking. But as soon as those demands rise, if you need to remember something for a short period, or in particular, if you need to resist current visual information, then we see 2 things. Firstly, it's our more close primate relatives that perform well if they're going to, and secondly, that older children are the only ones who can pass these kinds of tasks, and there's a correlation with their ability to verbally report that. And so I guess what I would like to do is try to integrate these two components a little bit more. So instead of trying to just reduce these peripheral demands, it would be nice to see how models and the cognitive control abilities interact to allow for success, because I think that's how we're going to get a fuller picture of what changes over primate evolution and what develops. And just to note, what happens when you add a verbal label? So maybe with 5-year-olds, the linguistic label is making a bit of a difference and also helping to drive that kind of selective attention to the important information. Okay, so younger children and some primates, abstract representations, I think, guides their learning and inference, and it's grounded in the perceptual input they see, or maybe time limited to some degree of occlusion. With older children, they're able to seek an abstract explanation, absent or in spite of perceptual information. And so tests that levy these demands on younger children or on primates are likely to find negative results. But what is it that really differs among those groups? That's the question, I think. So in this last study I want to talk about, we kind of shifted the focus to these peripheral demands of memory and attention. So we're building here on a study that we were part of in Edinburgh Zoo that was a big multi-lab study looking at short-term memory. It's a very simple test. You just hide a single reward in one of these cups and you wait either 0, 15 or 30 seconds. And we wanted to see among a variety of different primate species, how long could they remember where the reward was. And what we found was actually, this is not a very useful graph because it's just showing the sort of statistic of their difference from the mean, but we found big differences among the different primate species. So our closest relatives, the apes, can remember pretty much for the full 30 seconds where that reward is. The catarrhine and platyrrhine monkeys, they're doing pretty well at 15 seconds. And the squirrel monkeys and the lemurs, they can do 0, but not much beyond that. So what differs here? Is it just a case of memory, or is there a suite of differences of kind of executive cognitive differences that are varying across these primates? So our first step to try and crack into this problem was to try to see which abilities hang together, which executive function abilities hang together. And we developed this cognitive test battery that includes 3 sort of experiments trying to address the kind of 3 classic components of executive function: inhibition, attention shifting, and working memory. I'm not going to go into this study. Eva and Christoph did an amazing job in implementing this study across children and primates, and we published the findings. One thing that we found is that there is a correlation in general among these, but we couldn't find evidence for separable components that has been found in adults. Rather, a single factor model, especially with children, seem to explain the data best. So I'm going to talk about working memory now, but I just put this here to say that I'm not sure that that's a natural kind or that it's separable in these groups from the abilities of attentional control. Okay, so this study of working memory, it's quite sort of similar to the short-term memory study, but we've added interference. So you've got to find the reward in the first array, but you're also seeing where a reward is being hidden in the second array. And so the idea is that you would need to use working memory to keep that representation active in order to resist the interference in the second array, or keep the 2 separate. And we did this work at the Ngamba Chimpanzee Sanctuary in Kenya. And the chimpanzees also don't live there. They have a nice outdoor enclosure. So a similar testing environment. Okay, so I'm going to whip through this quickly. So what we found is that all of these groups, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and chimpanzees are above chance on this test, so they can resist the interference. They can deal with the 2 hiding locations. And it's only by the age of 4 to 5 that children actually outperform the chimpanzees. But by that age, they do. And so what we don't know yet is for the radiation of the other primates, how this ability would compare. But I think it's quite interesting to see how this is going sort of hand in hand with some of our findings that are more looking at their object representation and causal reasoning. And we get a similar trajectory with this task, which I won't explain in the interest of time, but what you need to do is kind of selectively attend to the rewarded stimulus and inhibit your attention to an object that is rewarded in another context. So they first learn without the kind of distractor objects where they can find rewards. And then in the sort of conflict tests and the attention shifting test, you need to resist the kind of competing demand on your attention in order to choose effectively in the two contexts. And we measure their errors, and we can see that indeed most of their errors are to the object that was rewarded in the other context. Errors that they don't make if you only have the two objects. And you use neutral distractors. Okay, so again, the chimpanzee's performance, it's above chance, and it's comparable to our 3- and 4-year-olds. The 5-year-olds are starting to pull away in terms of their ability to flexibly direct their attention in a goal-directed way. So to try and bring these different findings together, what I want to suggest is that over development and possibly over phylogeny as well, this kind of feedback or dynamic interplay between representational capabilities and abilities for cognitive control are going to be an important part of the story of how human cognition comes to differ from that of our closest relatives, or how cognition evolves. The sad thing about this is that the answer where one single change made a big difference was a lot easier to study. And so how do we make this tractable, empirically tractable, and look at how these different interactions among different abilities kind of play out? And that's where I think working together with computational modeling is going to be really important. So this is what we're doing at the moment. I'm working with Tom Morgan, who's here, Tom Griffiths, Natalia Velez, and some of our colleagues to try to look at interactions between different limited cognitive systems computationally and over evolution. And I think Tom's going to talk more about that in his talk. And hopefully in a way that would be empirically tractable with diverse species. And one thing that interestingly we're doing is looking at exploration in a virtual environment. So we want to develop a test bed where we could systematically vary the nature of the task that you have to do, but also the demands on attention in a more fine-grained way than is possible when you're dealing with 2 cups. So this would hopefully allow us to have sort of time course-based analyses and a wider variety of different testing situations. And the good thing is that Capuchins, so what we know so far is Capuchins like playing this game. And we've also been able to implement the short-term memory test in this environment, and we see a sort of similar decay of memory in this test. So if they need to wait 15 seconds before they can get to a reward that they've seen from another perspective, they can do that. If it takes 30 seconds, they're not doing very well. So that's what we would predict for the Capuchins. Okay, so I think that the future involves embracing team science and involves embracing interdisciplinary collaboration to be able to really get at the complexity of the answers to these questions. And I hope that if we want to understand intelligence, that you would agree that understanding this adaptive radiation of intelligence could be extremely informative for us in sort of fleshing out what intelligence really is. Okay, so with that, I'll thank these people and thank you very much for your attention.
Time for a few questions.
Yes, so this is just, I understand the work. I got the impression that the null hypothesis here would be that the explanation is given by just sort of this increasing ability in terms of working memory and other such capabilities. And so then there might be threshold phenomena where a certain species has a capability, but another one doesn't. But that may be due to, but underlying it may still be a continuum. It's just that the task is hard and you can't achieve it with that kind of that much working memory or whatever. So is this null hypothesis disproved? I mean, from in the examples you have, what would be a most striking case against the null hypothesis?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not sure it's even the null hypothesis. I think it might just be an alternative at this point. So you could say basically primates share representational skills for encoding objects that involves their features. They are that core knowledge is shared, and the difference that explains their different capabilities is, in fact, their working memory, their attention, like these executive abilities, how long you can hold that representation in memory. And I think that would be a really interesting finding. So I wouldn't be able to sort of falsify the null hypothesis. It's just that the bulk of the data is on what can animals do. So what can different primates do in terms of they can solve this problem, they can. So we don't have so much data really looking at the systematic variation in their memory and attention to see if that could explain or a model to account for how that would implicate their problem solving.
There's a context here, which is that with LLMs, there was this excitement of, oh, they have these emergent capabilities, and that was found to be not quite correct, and it was related to these kinds of threshold phenomena. And so what sounds more exciting is when you say, oh, now you have it, now you don't. But if it turns out to be due to a more boring explanation, we have to accept it, right?
Absolutely. I just think that another possibility is that as you increase capacity, different kinds of representations become more useful because you can use them offline, you can use them for longer periods of time. So it's possible that it's both. It's possible that it's one or the other. One enables the other, one constrains the other. But I don't find it boring in this context, personally, if that's the right answer, that you can get a lot of changes in your capability just by giving yourself a little bit more working memory capacity or duration, and suddenly you can search for explanations that were completely beyond the reach of your close relative or yourself a year ago. If that's the answer, then I think that's what I want to know.
So I really like this stuff also. I'm excited because it kind of points to data as an important thing. But I think there's like two different types of capacity. So there is working memory capacity, and then there's also just the overall capacity of the system. So you showed the skeleton, the skulls, and the bigger. And I think kind of this interesting result that you showed about the monkeys are as good as 3-year-olds, but then 4 and 5-year-olds are better. And there is also this issue of, well, the 5-year-olds, they have 2 more years worth of data. Because if we look at our systems, a large capacity system and a small capacity system, in the beginning they perform the same, and then the large capacity system, the more data you give it, well, it keeps improving with more data, whereas the smaller model kind of stops. So can you say something about these two types of data, the working memory and versus just the overall, the cumulative data that you get over your development?
Yeah. I haven't thought about it much before, but off the top of my head, it may be that that's almost 2 ways of saying the same thing. So a large capacity system with more data, why doesn't it have the working memory capability that it's capable of at the beginning? It may be that it needs more organization, more data to be able to make use of that capacity. But that trajectory does kind of change the capability of the system. So I don't know if I'm answering the question in the right way. Maybe I'm just agreeing with you that that's a possibility.
Well, I guess I wonder if those two. So, for example, my understanding is that the human working memory, or at least the verbal one, the 7 plus or minus 2, is actually relatively small compared to monkeys, right? Monkeys have a larger working memory in terms of kind of keeping the set of things that they can remember.
Not that I know of. Is there something you can? It might be. I just might not know about that.
Yeah,
Are you thinking about the numbers that they press in an order?
That's right.
Right.
That's
So that takes years of daily training. It's highly scaffolded. If you do the same training with undergraduates, They can do it too.
I see.
You have to pay them in the right currency. They don't do it for raisins. But yeah, no, I think that's
So basically, you're
it's
saying
a zombie idea. I think it won't die.
There is a monotonic increase, so that humans have the biggest working memory, and then the lower amount of smaller ones.
I mean, I've probably shown you all the data there is on it that I know of. That's actually comparative. So yes, by the age of 5, I think they do have a larger working memory. But they also have linguistics. So not only more data, they have language by the time they're 5. So a 5-year-old in my study might already be able to go, it's the left one, it's the left one, it's the left one, it's that one, it's the left one, it's the, and so they might be able to use a different mode of rehearsal that is unavailable to the others. So that could also be making a change in their, like, our sort of classic ability for chunking. And we haven't given the primates that mnemonic or that symbol to be able to do that. So they might not be different at all. They might just get more.
Let's do one last question.
Don't make me choose. Shiri, you have to fight it out with.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay,
No, Allison.
Oh, that's
So I noticed that Tom Griffiths is someone who's collaborating on this. So is your picture sort of a resource rationality picture? Is that the idea? So the idea would be that what kind of cognitive capacities you have partly is going to depend on trying to muster the cognitive resources that you have.
absolutely.
And do you think that's actually going to change things like what kind of representations you have? I also, maybe this is echoing Jitendra's point, I couldn't quite get if the idea is, okay, everybody's got the same representations, it's just that you've got more resources.
Yeah.
Or is it that?
So this is what we're trying to explore in the modeling space, and it's definitely inspired by this idea of resource rationality. And actually, the results can be a little bit surprising. So for example, we're looking at how maybe capacity and control trade off in working memory. So if you look at the performance of 7-year-olds and adults on a working memory task, adults outperform the 7-year-olds quite convincingly. And then if you try to build a model to explain that, you can get that by expanding capacity. So now you can remember just more, you've got more spaces to remember stuff. You can also get that difference by changing control. So you work harder, you'd have a different policy for maintaining the memory. And so those are both systems of control, but maybe with more capacity, it's a little bit more representational space. I'm not sure. So it seems like there might be multiple routes to the same end. And I guess hopefully exploring it in the modeling space will help us to design better experiments that can actually disambiguate what differs in this case. But I think, I feel personally we're at the beginning of asking that kind of question of what differs. Are we looking for, different modules in the brain that can represent something that they could never represent before, or better connected modules that are more multimodal or richer in some way? Or are we looking for just more capacity to maintain those representations for longer? Or it could even be an iterated process where once the representation is more powerful, it's worth holding on to it for longer because you can do more with it, or once it's more integrated, it's worth holding on to it for longer and finding ways to connect representations that weren't connected before. So I think I just can't really answer the question, but yeah, that's the idea, exactly. And it's the resource rational idea.
Okay, great. Let's thank Amanda again. Okay, so now we have